You know that feeling when you wake up thinking it's just another Tuesday, and then by sunset, the entire world has changed forever. That was July 14th, 1789 for me. I'm going to tell you exactly what it was like to be on the streets of Paris when the French Revolution began. Not the sanitized version you read in textbooks, not the romanticized painting of liberty leading the people. The real thing. The smell, the chaos, the fear, and yes, the absolute electricity in the air when thousands of people decide they've had enough. My name is Jean-Baptiste Mercier. I was 23 years old, working as a printer's assistant in the Latin Quarter, and I was there. Let me take you back. Paris, in early 1789, wasn't the city of light you might imagine. It was cramped, it was filthy, and it was angry. Picture this. You're living in a city of about 600,000 people, packed into winding medieval streets that hadn't changed much in centuries. The wealthy rode in carriages that splashed mud and worse all over you as you walked. The gap between rich and poor wasn't just visible, it was violent in its obviousness. I lived in a single room that I shared with two other men. We took turns sleeping because the bed was barely big enough for one person, let alone three. The window didn't close properly, so in winter we froze, and in summer the stench from the street made you want to vomit. But here's the thing that people don't really get about pre-revolutionary France. It wasn't just poverty that made people angry. It was the unfairness of it all that gnawed at you every single day. I worked 12, sometimes 14 hours a day, setting type for pamphlets and books. My hands were always stained with ink. My back hurt constantly from hunching over the press, and at the end of the week, I made barely enough to buy bread and pay for my third of that miserable room. Meanwhile, I'd see nobles stepping out of their mansions wearing coats that cost more than I'd earn in 5 years. They didn't work. They just existed in luxury because they happened to be born into the right family. The tax system, don't even get me started. The nobility and clergy paid basically nothing. Everything fell on people like me. The Third Estate, they called us. 98% of France, carrying the entire financial burden of a bankrupt kingdom. By spring of 1789, bread prices had nearly doubled. And when you're spending 80% of your income on bread, even in good times, doubling the price means you're starving. Actually starving. I remember seeing children in the street with distended bellies, old people who'd worked their whole lives begging for scraps. And all the while, Versailles glittered with gold in excess just a few miles away. Something had to give. In May, something remarkable happened. King Louis XVI called the Estates General. This was a big deal because it hadn't been convened since 1614. That's 175 years, if you're counting. The idea was that representatives from all three estates would come together to solve France's financial crisis. The clergy, the nobility, and everyone else would finally have a voice. People were optimistic. I was optimistic. Maybe, just maybe, things would change through proper channels. I remember standing in the shop where I worked, printing pamphlet after pamphlet about the Estates General. Political writing was everywhere suddenly. Ideas were flowing through Paris like the Seine. Enlightenment philosophy that had been quietly discussed in salons for decades was now shouted in the streets. Rousseau, Voltaire, the social contract, natural rights, equality. These weren't just abstract concepts anymore. They felt possible. They felt necessary, but the optimism didn't last long. The Third Estate representatives, including some brilliant minds like Mirabeau and Sieyès, quickly realized the whole thing was rigged. The voting was structured so the clergy and nobility could outvote the Third Estate 2-1, even though the Third Estate represented almost everyone in France. In June, the Third Estate did something audacious. They declared themselves the National Assembly and took the tennis court oath, swearing not to disband until France had a constitution. This was rebellion. Peaceful, procedural rebellion, but rebellion nonetheless. The king's response? He started moving troops toward Paris, thousands of them. Foreign mercenaries mostly, because he couldn't trust French soldiers not to sympathize with the people. When you see your own king bringing in foreign soldiers to intimidate you, it changes something in your mind. The social contract Rousseau wrote about? It felt completely broken. By early July, you could feel the tension in Paris like a physical thing. It was in the air, in every conversation, in the way people looked at the soldiers patrolling the streets. I'd go to work in the morning, and we'd hear rumors. The king was going to dissolve the National Assembly. He was going to arrest the representatives. He was going to bring in more troops and crush any dissent. The cafes were packed every evening with people debating, arguing, planning. The Palais-Royal, owned by the Duke of Orléans, became a particular hot spot. It was technically private property, so the police couldn't break up the gatherings there. Thousands of people would crowd into the gardens, listening to speakers standing on tables, on chairs, on whatever they could find. I went there on July 12th. That's when I first heard Camille Desmoulins speak. He was young, maybe a bit older than me, with a stutter that somehow made him more compelling rather than less. He stood on a table outside the Café de Foire, and he was electric. "Citizens," he shouted, "there is no time to lose. Necker has been dismissed." Jacques Necker was the finance minister, and more importantly, he was one of the few people in government who seemed to care about ordinary people. His dismissal meant the king was circling the wagons, surrounding himself only with hardliners. Desmoulins pulled a green leaf from a nearby tree and stuck it in his hat. "This shall be the color of hope," he declared. "Who will join me?" Within minutes, everyone was tearing leaves from the trees in the Palais-Royal, pinning them to their coats and hats. It was spontaneous, it was symbolic, and it was the moment I realized something big was about to happen. The crowd poured out of the Palais-Royal and into the streets. We marched through Paris, and we kept growing. Hundreds became thousands. We wanted weapons. The question was where to get them. Some people broke into gunsmiths' shops. Others raided the Hôtel des Invalides, a veterans' hospital that had a weapons cache. I followed the crowd there on the morning of July 14th. The Invalides was supposed to be guarded, but the soldiers there didn't even try to stop us. They stepped aside. Some of them even helped us carry out the muskets. That's when I first understood that this wasn't just a mob. This was the people, and even the king's own soldiers were choosing sides. We got about 28,000 muskets from the Invalides. But there was a problem. No gunpowder. Someone in the crowd shouted, "The Bastille! They have powder at the Bastille!" And just like that, thousands of us turned east and started marching toward the most hated symbol of royal tyranny in all of Paris. Let me tell you about the Bastille. It was a medieval fortress with walls 80 feet high and towers that loomed over the Faubourg Saint-Antoine neighborhood. It had been used as a state prison for centuries. People could be locked up there indefinitely without trial, just on the king's order, by something called a lettre de cachet. It represented everything wrong with the arbitrary power of the monarchy. Your freedom, your life, could be taken on a whim. By the time we arrived that morning, thousands of people had already gathered in the streets around the fortress. The crowd was loud, angry, but also uncertain. What exactly were we doing? Were we asking for the gunpowder? Were we demanding it? Were we taking it? A delegation of citizens tried to negotiate with the Marquis de Launay, the governor of the Bastille. They wanted the powder, and they wanted him to withdraw the cannons that were pointed at the crowd from the fortress walls. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher. It was hot, and people were getting impatient. I stood in the crowd, holding one of the muskets from the Invalides, and I remember thinking, this is insane. What are we doing? That fortress is impregnable. Even if we wanted to attack it, we'd never get through those walls. But the crowd kept growing, and the mood kept darkening. Then, sometime after 1 o'clock, something happened that I still don't fully understand. Some people claim the crowd attacked first. Others say someone cut the chains on the drawbridge. There are a dozen different versions. What I know is this. Suddenly, the drawbridge was down, and people were pouring into the outer courtyard of the Bastille. And then the garrison opened fire. The sound of musket fire in a confined space is something I'll never forget. It's not like in movies. It's deafening, it's confusing, and the smoke is so thick you can't see what's happening 3 feet in front of you. People started falling. I saw a man next to me take a shot to the chest and go down without even crying out. Blood was everywhere. The crowd surged backward, then forward again. Someone was screaming for everyone to take cover. Someone else was shouting to return fire. It was chaos. I ended up pressed against a wall, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I'd never been in a fight in my life, let alone a battle. I was a printer. I worked with words and paper, not weapons and blood. But I was there, and there was no leaving. The fighting went on for hours. The defenders had cannons, and they used them. The crowd had muskets, but half of us didn't really know how to use them properly. We were bakers and shopkeepers and laborers, not soldiers. What we had was numbers and determination and a kind of reckless courage that came from years of pent-up rage finally finding a release. Around mid-afternoon, something changed. A group of French guards, defectors from the king's own army, showed up with actual cannons. They positioned them to fire at the Bastille's gates. Suddenly, this wasn't just an angry mob anymore. This was an actual assault force. The garrison inside had to realize they couldn't hold out. They were outnumbered, and now they were outgunned. Around 5 o'clock in the evening, they raised a white flag. A ceasefire was negotiated. The defenders would surrender if they were guaranteed safe passage. I remember feeling this wave of disbelief wash over me. We'd actually done it. We'd taken the Bastille. The Bastille fell around 5:30 p.m. But the story doesn't end there. In fact, that's when things got even more complicated. The crowd poured into the fortress. People were looking for prisoners, expecting to find hundreds of political prisoners languishing in dungeons. Instead, we found 7 prisoners total. 4 counterfeiters, 2 mentally ill men, and 1 aristocrat locked up by his family. It was almost anticlimactic, but it didn't matter. The Bastille itself was the symbol. The fact that it had fallen, that the people had stormed a royal fortress and won, that was what mattered. The governor, Delaunay, was supposed to be given safe passage, but the crowd was angry. People had died. Their friends, their neighbors. Someone started shouting that Delaunay had ordered his men to fire on a peace delegation earlier in the day. The crowd turned on him. I won't describe what happened next in detail because it was brutal and ugly. Delaunay was killed. So were several of the garrison soldiers who'd been promised safety. Their heads were put on pikes and paraded through the streets. I didn't participate in the killing, but I didn't stop it either. I stood there, watching, and I felt sick, but also numb. This was revolution, I thought. This was what it actually looked like. Not noble and heroic, but messy and violent and terrifying. As night fell, I walked back through Paris. Everywhere I looked, people were celebrating. They were dancing in the streets, singing, embracing strangers. The Bastille had fallen. The people had won a victory against tyranny. But I kept thinking about the blood on the cobblestones, about the men I'd seen die, about how quickly everything had spiraled from a protest to a siege to a slaughter. I didn't sleep much that night. When I went to work the next morning, everything felt different. People walked differently. They talked differently. There was this sense of possibility in the air, but also fear. What would the king do? Would he send the army to crush Paris? Would there be reprisals? Instead, something remarkable happened. The king backed down. He went to the National Assembly and essentially accepted what had happened. He recalled Necker. He withdrew the troops from around Paris. He even wore the tricolour cockade, the symbol of the revolution, when he visited Paris a few days later. For a brief moment, it seemed like maybe this could all work out. Maybe France could become a constitutional monarchy. Maybe the bloodshed was over. I should have known better. See, July 14th, 1789 wasn't the French Revolution. It was the beginning of the French Revolution. Over the next few years, I watched Paris descend into levels of violence that made the storming of the Bastille look like a minor scuffle. The royal family tried to flee in 1791 and were caught. The king who'd worn the tricolour cockade was guillotined in 1793. The queen followed. Then the moderate revolutionaries were guillotined by the radical revolutionaries. Then the radical revolutionaries started guillotining each other. The reign of terror killed tens of thousands. The Committee of Public Safety became as tyrannical as any king. The revolution ate its own children, as the saying goes. I survived, somehow. Maybe because I kept my head down, maybe because I was lucky. Many of my friends from those early days didn't make it. Desmoulins, the young man who'd stood on that table in the Palais-Royal and called us to action. Guillotined in 1794, labeled an enemy of the revolution he'd helped start. People always ask me, was it worth it? That's a complicated question. The France that emerged from the revolution was different. Not perfect, not even close to perfect. Napoleon turned the republic into an empire. The monarchy was eventually restored, then overthrown again. France went through convulsions for decades. But something fundamental had changed. The idea that kings ruled by divine right was shattered. The concept that ordinary people had rights, that they deserved a say in their government, that they could challenge authority when it became tyrannical, these ideas became impossible to suppress. The revolution spread to Haiti, where enslaved people applied revolutionary ideals to their own situation and won their freedom. To Latin America, eventually, in ways both direct and indirect, to nearly every corner of the world. So, was it worth it? The violence, the chaos, the years of instability? I honestly don't know. What I do know is that July 14th, 1789 changed the course of human history. I was there. I was a small part of it. And I've spent the rest of my life trying to understand what it all meant. Here's what the history books often miss about the French Revolution. It wasn't one thing. It wasn't one event, one ideology, one movement. It was thousands of individual decisions by thousands of individual people who were scared and angry and hopeful and desperate all at the same time. On July 14th, I made a choice to join the crowd marching to the Bastille. I could have stayed home, I could have gone to work, I could have decided it wasn't my fight, but I didn't. And neither did thousands of others. Were we heroes? Were we a mob? Were we instruments of historical inevitability or just people who'd had enough? All of the above, probably. The textbooks also tend to sanitize the violence. They tell you the Bastille fell, but they don't describe the smell of gunpowder and blood. They mention the reign of terror, but they don't tell you what it was like to walk past the guillotine every day on your way to work, wondering if tomorrow it would be your turn. They talk about ideals, liberty, equality, fraternity, but they don't talk about how hard it is to hold on to those ideals when you're scared and hungry and the person next to you is calling for someone's head on a pike. Revolution is messy. It's complicated. It brings out the best and worst in people, often simultaneously. Over the years, I've watched July 14th become a national holiday. Bastille Day, they call it. There are parades and fireworks and celebrations, and that's fine. I understand why. Societies need their founding myths, their moments of glory to rally around. But sometimes I wonder what people think they're celebrating. Are they celebrating the ideals of the revolution? The triumph of the people over tyranny? The birth of modern democracy? Or are they celebrating a specific day when a crowd of scared, angry people attacked a fortress, and some of them died, and some of the defenders died, and by the end of it, 7 confused prisoners were freed and everyone was covered in blood and smoke? Because both versions are true. The revolution was about high ideals and brutal realities. It was about philosophy and violence. It was about the best impulses of humanity and the worst. You can't separate them. You can't take the good and pretend the bad didn't happen. If there's one thing I learned from being there on July 14th, 1789, it's this. Change is possible, but it's never clean. The old regime in France was genuinely terrible. The tax system was unfair. The legal system was arbitrary. People were starving while aristocrats lived in absurd luxury. Something needed to change. And it did change. The people made it change. But the cost was enormous. Not just in lives lost during the revolution itself, but in the decades of instability that followed. In the way the revolution's ideals were twisted and used to justify new forms of tyranny. Does that mean we shouldn't have done it? That we should have just accepted the status quo because trying to change it was too dangerous? I don't think so. But I also think we should be honest about what revolution entails. It's not a glorious adventure. It's not a parade with flags and stirring music. It's real people making impossible choices in terrible circumstances. Here's something I've wrestled with for my entire life. Was the violence necessary? Could the revolution have succeeded without it? Could we have negotiated our way to a better France? Could the king have been convinced to give up power peacefully? I don't know. What I do know is that by July 14th, peaceful options felt exhausted. We'd tried the Estates General. The king had responded by bringing in troops. We'd tried negotiations at the Bastille. The garrison had responded with cannon fire. At a certain point, when all other avenues are closed, when power refuses to negotiate in good faith, violence becomes almost inevitable. But here's the thing. Once violence starts, it's almost impossible to control. The attack on the Bastille led to the September massacres, which led to the guillotine, which led to the terror, which led to war, which led to Napoleon and more war and more death. A straight line from a mob storming a fortress to the bodies of hundreds of thousands strewn across Europe. So was the violence necessary? Maybe in the moment, yes. But could we have stopped it from spiraling? Could we have achieved change without the terror? I think about that a lot. I wish I had an answer. I want to tell you about some of the people I met that day, because history tends to focus on the famous figures, Robespierre, Danton, Marat. But the revolution was made by ordinary people whose names you'll never learn. There was François, a baker from the Marais district. He was in his 50s with flour permanently under his fingernails. He joined the march to the Bastille because bread prices had made it impossible for him to stay in business. He took a musket ball to the leg during the fighting. I saw him afterward, sitting against a wall, bleeding through a makeshift bandage, and he was smiling. "We did it," he kept saying. "We actually did it." François died 3 weeks later. The leg got infected. There was Marie, a laundress who fought alongside the men at the Bastille. People forget that women were there too, that they fought and died just like the men. Marie was fierce, fearless. She grabbed a pike from a fallen defender and used it to help break through one of the gates. She survived the Bastille but was killed during the September massacres 3 years later, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. There was Antoine, a philosophy student who'd read all of Rousseau and Voltaire and could quote them from memory. He was the one explaining to people why we were fighting, what it all meant in terms of natural rights and social contracts. He joined the army during the Revolutionary Wars and died at Valmy in 1792, defending the revolution against Prussian invaders. These were real people. They had families, dreams, fears. They weren't abstractions in a history book. They were there, next to me, making the same impossible choices I was making. And most of them didn't survive to see how it all turned out. Something else the textbooks often gloss over. Not everyone supported the revolution. There were plenty of people in France who thought we were destroying something valuable, who believed in the monarchy, in the old order, in tradition and hierarchy. Some of them fought back. The Vendée region rose in counter-revolution. The nobility who escaped France formed armies abroad and tried to invade and restore the old regime. And you know what? I can't even say they were completely wrong. The revolution destroyed institutions that had existed for centuries. It tore apart the social fabric of France. It led to war and chaos and suffering on a massive scale. From their perspective, we were the villains. We were the destroyers, the anarchists, the murderers. History is written by the winners, and the revolution ultimately won, so we think of it as progress. But it didn't feel like progress for the aristocrats whose heads were on pikes. It didn't feel like progress for the priests who were persecuted. It didn't feel like progress for the peasants in the Vendée whose villages were burned. I'm not saying the old regime should have been preserved, but I am saying the revolution's victory came at an enormous cost that fell most heavily on people who maybe didn't deserve it. If I could go back to July 14th, 1789, knowing what I know now, would I still march to the Bastille? I've asked myself this question 1,000 times. The honest answer is, I don't know. On one hand, the revolution did lead to lasting change. France became a republic, eventually. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, however imperfectly realized, became central to French identity. The revolution inspired democratic movements around the world. On the other hand, the suffering, the terror, the wars, the countless lives lost, the way the revolution devoured its own children. Could there have been a better way? Could we have pushed for reform without revolution? Could we have had revolution without terror? Maybe. Maybe not. The problem with history is you can't run the experiment twice. You can't see what would have happened if we'd made different choices. All I know is that on July 14th, 1789, I was a young man who was hungry and angry and tired of being treated as less than human by people who thought their birth made them better than me. And when the moment came to stand up, I stood up. For better or worse, that's what I did. Today, Bastille Day is celebrated as France's national holiday. There are fireworks and military parades down the Champs-Élysées. It's a symbol of French independence and the triumph of republican values. The Bastille itself was torn down stone by stone in the months after it fell. Someone made a fortune carving the stones into paperweights and selling them as souvenirs. Where the fortress once stood, there's now a column and a plaza. People walk across it every day, probably without thinking about what happened there. That's okay. That's how history works. Events that seemed earth-shattering to the people who lived through them become distant symbols to later generations. But I was there. I remember. I remember the heat of that July day, the sound of the cannons, the smell of gunpowder and blood, the weight of the musket in my hands. I remember the feeling of being part of something larger than myself, the sense that we were making history, even as we had no idea what we were making. I remember the hope, and I remember the horror. Both were real, both mattered. If you're watching this video, you're probably learning about the French Revolution in school. You're probably being taught about the causes and the key events and the important figures. That's all fine. That's all important. But I want you to understand something. Revolutions are made by real people facing real choices in real time. We didn't know we were starting the French Revolution when we marched to the Bastille. We thought we were getting gunpowder. We thought we were making a statement. We thought maybe we were defending Paris from the foreign troops the king had brought in. We had no idea that day would be remembered for centuries, that it would become a national holiday, that historians would analyze every detail of what happened. We were just people who'd had enough. And here's what I want you to take away from my story. When you learn about historical events, remember that they were made by people like you. People who were scared and brave and confused and certain all at the same time. History isn't inevitable. It's the result of millions of individual choices. The choice to march or stay home. The choice to fight or flee. The choice to speak up or stay silent. Every moment of your life, you're making history. Most of it won't be remembered. Most of it won't matter beyond your immediate circle. But sometimes, you find yourself in a moment where your choices do matter, where what you do or don't do will ripple outward in ways you can't predict. When that moment comes, you won't know it's that moment. You'll just have to make the best choice you can with the information you have. That's what I did on July 14th, 1789. I chose to march. I chose to fight. I chose to be part of the revolution. I've spent my whole life since then wondering if I chose right. Let me tell you something else the textbooks don't really convey. The grief. In the months and years after the Bastille fell, I watched friends die. Some in battle, some on the guillotine, some from disease and hunger during the worst of the terror. Every time I heard that someone I knew had been arrested, my stomach would drop. Because arrest during the terror usually meant one thing. I went to watch some of the executions, not because I wanted to, but because it felt like I owed it to them, to bear witness, to remember. The guillotine was supposed to be humane, a quick, painless death, more merciful than the old methods of execution. Maybe it was, but there's nothing merciful about watching someone you know, someone you laughed with, argued with, fought alongside, being marched up to a platform and having their head cut off. The revolution consumed so many good people, people who genuinely wanted to make France better, people who believed in liberty and equality and fraternity. It consumed them just as readily as it consumed the tyrants and aristocrats. That's the tragedy of it. The revolution became the thing it claimed to oppose. It became arbitrary. It became cruel. It became willing to sacrifice anyone in the name of ideological purity. And all of us who survived, we carry that weight. We carry the memory of what was done in the name of ideals we still believe in. People always want to know, when did you realize the revolution had gone too far? For me, it was September 1792. The September massacres. Rumors had spread that prisoners in Paris jails were plotting to escape and join counter-revolutionary forces. It was probably nonsense, just paranoia in the wake of Prussian armies invading France. But mobs stormed the prisons and killed over 1,000 prisoners. They held impromptu trials where the verdict was almost always guilty. Then they executed people in the streets, right outside the prison walls. I walked past one of the prisons during the massacres. The bodies were piled like cordwood. Blood ran in the gutters, and people were cheering. That's when I realized we'd crossed a line. This wasn't revolution anymore. This wasn't fighting for liberty and equality. This was just bloodlust. This was violence for its own sake. But by then, it was too late to stop it. The revolution had its own momentum. All any of us could do was try to survive it. You learn things about people when society breaks down, when the normal rules and structures fall away, and everyone has to decide for themselves what's right and wrong. Some people become heroes. They risk everything to protect others. They stand up for their principles even when it costs them their lives. Some people become monsters. They use the chaos as an excuse to settle old grudges, to take what they want, to indulge their worst impulses. But most people just try to survive. They keep their heads down. They go along with whoever seems to be winning. They compromise their principles a little at a time until they don't recognize themselves anymore. I don't judge them for it. I understand it. There were times I did the same thing. The revolution taught me that there's no clear line between good and evil. There are just people trying to navigate impossible situations, making choices that seem right in the moment, but look questionable in hindsight. It taught me that ideology can justify anything. That once you believe you're fighting for a righteous cause, it becomes easy to rationalize terrible actions. It taught me that violence is easier to start than to stop. That once blood is spilled, more blood seems inevitable, and it taught me that change is possible. That ordinary people can overthrow powerful institutions. That the status quo is never as permanent as it seems. All of these lessons are true. All of them matter. If I could go back and talk to the 23-year-old version of me standing in the crowd outside the Bastille on July 14th, 1789, what would I say? I think I'd tell him, "You're right to be angry. The system is unjust. It needs to change. You're right to fight for that. But also, be careful. Be aware that righteous anger can turn into something darker. That the people fighting beside you today might become your enemies tomorrow. That the revolution will demand more from you than you can imagine. Hold on to your principles. Don't let the cause become more important than the individuals you're supposedly fighting for. Don't let ideology blind you to the humanity of the people around you. And remember, this moment, this day, this revolution, it's not the end of the story. It's just the beginning. The hard part comes after. Figuring out how to build something better from the ruins of what you've destroyed. That's what you need to prepare for. Not just the destruction, but the creation. Would he listen? Probably not. At 23, convinced of your own righteousness, surrounded by thousands of people who share your conviction, you don't want to hear about caution and nuance. You want to storm the Bastille. Here's something ironic. I learned to read and think critically because of Enlightenment philosophy. Rousseau, Voltaire, Diderot. These writers taught me that I had natural rights, that I deserved dignity, that authority should be questioned. The revolution was, in many ways, the practical application of Enlightenment ideals. But the revolution also showed the limits of those ideals. It showed what happens when abstract principles meet messy reality. Liberty is a beautiful concept. But what do you do when one person's liberty conflicts with another's? When the liberty of the people as a collective seems to require limiting the liberty of individuals? Equality is essential. But equality of what? Opportunity, outcomes, before the law, in wealth. Fraternity sounds wonderful, but what about the people who don't want to be your brothers? What about the counter-revolutionaries, the nobles, the clergy? Do they get fraternity too, or are they excluded from the community? The revolution tried to answer these questions through violence and ideology. It didn't work out well. I still believe in Enlightenment ideals. I still think they're worth fighting for, but I also know now that ideals alone aren't enough. You need institutions, you need compromise, you need people willing to talk to those they disagree with rather than just executing them. The revolution taught me that destroying the old order is the easy part. Building something better is infinitely harder. I was idealistic on July 14, 1789. I believed we were creating a better world. I believed that once we overthrew tyranny, liberty and equality and fraternity would naturally follow. By 1794, during the height of the terror, that idealism was gone. It had been burned away by too much death, too much betrayal, too much evidence that humans are complicated and that simple solutions don't exist. But here's the strange thing. Losing my idealism didn't make me cynical. It made me more committed to trying to make things better, just in smaller, more pragmatic ways. I couldn't change France. I couldn't create the perfect republic. I couldn't make the revolution live up to its promises. But I could help my neighbors. I could treat people with dignity. I could speak up when I saw injustice on a small scale. I could preserve what was good and push back against what was bad. One small action at a time. Maybe that's the real lesson of the revolution. Maybe the big dramatic gestures, storming the Bastille, declaring a republic, executing the king, maybe those aren't actually the most important things. Maybe what matters more is what happens every day after. How you treat the person next to you, whether you hold on to your humanity in difficult circumstances, whether you're willing to do the hard, unglamorous work of building institutions that actually function. I don't know. I'm an old man now, still trying to make sense of it all. I know someday people will study the French Revolution in detail. They'll analyze the economic causes and the political factors and the intellectual currents that led to it. They'll probably get a lot of it right. The bread prices, the financial crisis, the influence of Enlightenment philosophy. All of that mattered. But I want to make sure they understand something else. It was also personal. It was about the way the noble's carriage splashed mud on you and the coachman laughed. It was about working 14 hours a day and still not having enough to eat. It was about watching your mother beg for bread and being powerless to help her. It was about being treated as less than human every single day and finally reaching a point where you couldn't take it anymore. The economic and political and intellectual factors explain why a revolution was possible. But personal rage and humiliation and desperation explain why it actually happened. Don't forget that when you write your textbooks and dissertations, don't reduce us to historical forces and inevitable trends. We were people. We made choices. We could have chosen differently. Remembering is hard. Remembering honestly is even harder. It would be easy for me to cast myself as a hero in this story, to emphasize the brave moments and downplay the times I was scared or cruel or morally compromised. It would be easy to romanticize the revolution, to focus on the ideals and ignore the reality. But I owe it to the people who died, the ones who fought for the revolution and the ones who died because of it. To be honest, the revolution was glorious and terrible. It was necessary and destructive. It freed France from tyranny and unleashed new forms of oppression. I was part of it. I made it happen, and I've spent the rest of my life carrying the weight of that. Some nights I still dream about July 14th. I hear the cannons, I smell the gunpowder, I see Francois smile as he bled out from his leg wound. Other nights I dream about what didn't happen, the reforms that could have been negotiated, the lives that could have been saved, the better path we might have found if we'd been wiser or luckier or just different people. But we were who we were. We did what we did, and France was never the same. I'm an old man now. Most of the people who were there on July 14th, 1789 are dead. Soon I will be too. When I'm gone, the revolution will belong entirely to historians and memory. It will be dates and facts and analysis. That's okay. That's how it should be. But before I go, I wanted to tell you what it was actually like. Not the sanitized version or the heroic version or the condemnatory version. Just the truth, as I experienced it. We overthrew a tyrannical system. We started a revolution that changed the world. We fought for ideals that still matter today. And we unleashed violence and chaos that cost hundreds of thousands of lives and led to new forms of tyranny. Both things are true. I don't regret being there on July 14th. I don't regret fighting for change, but I do regret how naive we were, how unprepared for what would follow, how willing to accept violence as a solution to complex problems. If there's a lesson in my story, maybe it's this. Fight for what you believe in, but stay humble. Be willing to change your mind. Treat your enemies as human beings. Remember that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and never, ever think that violence can be controlled once it starts. If you made it this far in the video, thank you. Seriously, this isn't the usual YouTube content, I know. It's long, it's heavy, it's complicated, but I think it matters. I think understanding what the French Revolution was really like, not the mythology, but the reality, helps us understand our own time better. We live in an age of anger and polarization. We have our own injustices to fight against. We have our own choices to make about how to create change. So here's my question for you. What are you going to do? I'm not saying you need to storm any fortresses. I'm not advocating for revolution, but I am saying that change requires action, that injustice doesn't fix itself, that someone has to stand up. Maybe that someone is you. Maybe your July 14th is coming. Maybe it's already here. What will you do when it arrives? Think about it. Learn from history. Learn from my mistakes and the mistakes of the revolution, and then make your own choice. If you found this video helpful or thought-provoking, hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into historical events from the perspective of the people who lived through them, and leave a comment. I want to know what you think. Do you think the French Revolution was worth it? Would you have joined the crowd marching to the Bastille? How do you think about the balance between ideals and violence, between change and stability? Let's have a real conversation about this. Because history isn't dead. It's alive in the choices we make every day. Thanks for watching. And remember, you're making history right now. Make it count.